The first thing I noticed was the
Don't do
silence,
this.
not the
You
peaceful
know I
kind,
didn't
but the
mean
heavy
it.
kind that presses
I don't know
against
what
your
to
chest
believe
when you're
anymore.
trying not to breathe too loud, because when my boss looked up from her desk and asked, half laughing and half serious, should I change here or should I look away, time didn't just slow down, it folded in on itself, dragging every bad decision, every sleepless night, every sacrifice I'd made as a single dad straight into that moment, and I remember thinking how strange it was that life could pivot on a sentence said so casually, like she was asking whether to open a window, not whether to cross a line that neither of us had named but both of us felt. I hadn't planned on being in her office after hours, I'd only stayed late because daycare fines didn't care that your boss needed last-minute reports, and my phone buzzed twice in my pocket with messages from the neighbor watching my daughter, each vibration tightening the knot in my stomach. I was tired, bone tired, the kind of tired that comes from trying to be two parents in one body while pretending at work that nothing in your life is ever on fire. She stood near the coat rack, blazer already off, sleeves rolled slightly like she did when she was thinking hard, and the overhead light caught the faint crease between her eyebrows that no one else ever seemed to notice. People thought she was intimidating, sharp, ambitious, untouchable, but I'd seen her drink cold coffee without flinching and forget her own lunch meetings. I'd seen her human moments, mostly because I was always there early and always left late, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because providing stability for a 5-year-old meant never letting your guard down. The question hung there, awkward and unfinished, and in that fraction of a second my mind did what it always did, it ran through consequences instead of fantasies, HR policies, power dynamics, rumors, the look on my daughter's face if I lost this job, the quiet shame of knowing I'd let something simple turn complicated. I could have laughed it off. I could have turned around. I could have said something clever. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, because sometimes integrity isn't dramatic, it's just stillness, and I realized she wasn't really asking about changing clothes, she was asking whether I saw her as a position or a person, whether I would make it weird, whether I was safe. My answer mattered in ways I didn't yet understand. I cleared my throat, feeling my heartbeat in my ears, and said calmly, "You don't need to change anything for me. I'll step outside," and even as I said it, I heard the weight behind my words, not performative, not polite, just honest, because respect wasn't something I switched on when it was convenient, it was something my daughter was learning from watching me every day. I turned toward the door, hand already on the handle, when she spoke again, softer this time, my name spoken like a question rather than a command, and that's when I sensed something shift, not attraction, not tension, but recognition, like two people standing at opposite ends of a bridge realizing at the same time that they'd both been afraid to step forward. She didn't tell me to stop. She didn't tell me to stay. She just said, "No one's ever answered that way before," and I smiled without turning around, because I didn't know how to respond to that without sounding either proud or defensive, and neither felt right. Outside her office, the hallway lights hummed, and as I leaned against the wall waiting, memories crept in the way they always did when I slowed down, the night my wife packed a suitcase and left without slamming the door, the months after where my daughter asked when mommy was coming home and I had to learn how to explain absence without poisoning hope, the mornings where I tied tiny shoelaces with shaking hands because I hadn't slept, the quiet promise I made to myself that no matter how lonely I got, I would never trade my values for comfort. When she opened the door again, she was different, not undressed, not exposed, just more present, and she looked at me like she was seeing the whole story instead of just my title on a spreadsheet. We walked down the hallway together, not touching, not speaking much, but something had undeniably changed, and when she asked casually if I had kids, like she didn't already know from my emergency leave forms, I told her about my daughter, about how she hated broccoli but loved dinosaurs, and how bedtime stories were sacred law in our house. She listened, really listened, and for the first time since I'd started working there, she didn't check her phone while I spoke. By the time we reached the lobby, the building felt too big and too empty, and she said, "You're a good man," not as praise, but as observation, and I shrugged because goodness felt like a bare minimum, not an achievement. I left that night thinking it was over, that the moment would dissolve into nothing more than a story I'd never tell, but the next morning, when she rearranged the meeting agenda so I could leave early for my daughter's school event, without explanation, without announcement, I understood that sometimes the smallest answers echo the loudest, and that question she'd asked hadn't been a test of attraction at all, but a test of character, one I hadn't even known I was taking, and as I picked up my daughter that afternoon and she ran into my arms like I was the only solid thing in her universe, I realized the real change hadn't happened in my boss's office, it had happened in me, because for the first time in a long time, I felt seen without being exposed, respected without being elevated, and I didn't know it yet, but that answer was about to change everything that I didn't expect the answer to follow me home. But it did, settling into the quiet of my apartment like an uninvited thought that refused to leave, whispering questions while I reheated leftovers and helped my daughter brush her teeth, her small hands gripping the sink as she made funny faces at her reflection, and I wondered if she'd one day understand how close life always is to changing in ways you can't prepare for. That night, after she fell asleep with her stuffed dinosaur tucked under her chin, I sat on the edge of the couch staring at my phone, half expecting an email, a message, some formal acknowledgement of the moment, but nothing came, and that was somehow more unsettling than if something had. Work the next day was different in subtle ways that only someone used to scanning rooms for emotional weather could notice, the way conversations paused when my boss entered, the way her gaze found mine for just a fraction longer before she looked away, the way she spoke to me with the same authority but softened edges, like she was careful not to lean too close to the memory we now shared. I kept my head down, focused on tasks, spreadsheets blurring into one another, reminding myself that moments don't always mean momentum, that sometimes they're just mirrors showing you who you already are. But around mid-morning, when she called me into her office again, the knot in my stomach returned, tighter this time, because uncertainty is heavier than fear, and as I sat across from her, hands folded, posture neutral, she studied me with a look that felt less like evaluation and more like curiosity. She didn't mention the night before. Instead, she asked how my daughter's school event went, and when I told her about the crooked paper crown and the off-key singing, she smiled in a way that made the room feel warmer, then leaned back and said something that surprised me more than the question had, "I need someone I can trust for a new role. Not someone impressive. Someone steady." The word steady landed hard, because it felt like she'd reached into my life and pulled out the one thing I'd worked hardest to become, not flashy, not ambitious in the traditional sense, just dependable, and I wondered if she knew how rarely that quality is recognized before it's missed. She explained the responsibilities, the longer hours, the flexibility, and for the first time in my career, I didn't immediately say yes, because being a single dad teaches you that opportunity isn't just about what you gain, it's about what it costs, and I told her honestly that I'd need time to think, that my daughter came first. She nodded, not offended, not surprised, just thoughtful, and said, "That's exactly why I asked you." Over the next few weeks, our interactions settled into a rhythm that felt intentional but unspoken, no lines crossed, no whispers, just mutual respect layered with an awareness that something foundational had shifted. She started leaving earlier sometimes, delegating more, and once, when I mentioned an upcoming doctor's appointment for my daughter, she rearranged deadlines without making it feel like a favor. I caught myself defending her when coworkers complained, not out of loyalty, but out of understanding, because I'd seen her choose restraint when she could have chosen ease. One evening, as we were the last two in the office again, she paused by my desk and said quietly, "You know, when I asked that question, I was tired of being looked at like a complication," and I replied just as quietly, "And I was tired of being seen as disposable," and in that shared honesty, something settled between us, not romance, not expectation, just a recognition that we were both carrying invisible weight. I went home that night lighter, not because anything had happened, but because nothing had been taken from me to earn that lightness. When I finally agreed to the new role, it wasn't because of her, but because I realized my daughter deserved to see her father valued for who he was, not just what he produced, and when I told her yes, she didn't celebrate, she simply said, "I won't make you regret it," like a promise instead of a pitch. The days grew fuller, the balance more delicate, but I managed, because I always had, and every so often, when our paths crossed in the hallway, there was that quiet understanding again, a shared memory of a moment where character had been chosen over convenience. I didn't know then that the real test wasn't behind us, but ahead, waiting for the moment when the world would misinterpret our respect as something else entirely, when a rumor would force us both to decide how much truth we were willing to defend, but that was still coming, like a distant storm you sense before you see. And as I tucked my daughter into bed one night and she asked, "Daddy, do you like your boss?" I answered honestly, "I respect her," and realized how rare it is for a simple answer to still be the right one, and how that first question, the one about changing or looking away, had quietly rewritten the rules of my life without asking permission.